time and Evan told this story, so I transition moment. I'll tell this sort of story that happened to me as well. And I was at a Manchester middle school, and I do an entirely different type of program for middle school kids. And it's really about, how and why we other others. This is where I'm really looking at. And so I did my thing. I laughed. I said, you're there 90 minutes, and I all day long different classes. And I came back the next day. Luckily, I was invited back to do a follow-up. When I walked in the door, I'll never forget this. There were a couple kids right in the main doorway. And there was something going on. They were picking on some kid or whatever it is. And this other kid comes running over and didn't even see me there. So I was just walking in and said, stop that right now. That's what Mr. White talked about yesterday, and we don't do that here. Right? And I went, that is the greatest story I can now share forever. Thank you very much. So I think the point of that story and the anecdotes that Evan shared as well is that education can indeed make a tremendous impact, even with us as touching service. And so we target things for different audiences. Obviously, we're not teaching in middle school what we do for high school, or I also do higher ed. I do everything from elementary school to adult education. So I'm all over. So with most of us, we settle in again. Please take your time getting goodies in the back. And if you feel like getting up during our roundtable, feel free to do so. We're all amongst friends here. I'd like to sort of start, really, I think, by shifting the conversation toward you. And you now know 5 of us here. And I think many different issues or thoughts may have come up. We are, and of course, for those worried about talking to Kathy as well, it's always one of these things where what can I ask of survivors? I have found with Kathy and most survivors I've worked with, there's almost nothing you can't ask them. And so feel free to ask those questions. So we have educators, survivor, Senator Khan, who also has a connection to the Holocaust directly that he did not mention. And in fact, I think what I'll do is I'll have him briefly tell that story, and then that'll start off conversation with you. So, of course, as he's leaving, it's good time.
So keeping it brief, my parents are Holocaust survivors from Germany, and they emigrated from Germany in my dad in 1936, but his parents in 1941, and the United States was not involved in the war, and German Jews were mostly persecuted, but not necessarily rounded up until 42, when mass roundups occurred. My mom left in December of 1940 with her parents. She's significantly younger than my dad. As passed, my mom, though, is 94, seeing 95 this October. Amazing survivor. So for me, it's the experience of a first generation child in the United States. Sometimes being observed because I'm white. I mean, we're going to start to get into some of these other issues, right? But I'm white. My difference of being a Jew dissolves when I don't proclaim that I'm Jewish. A difference that other peoples of nationalities and ethnicities can't, and race can't disguise. But my parents, because of their accents, anybody that knew me or I was growing up with knew that they were immigrants to the United States. So that part of me was harder to disguise. And there were 1950s and 60s, there were people who saw Jews as being different and just totally insensitive. And so the stories, and I think you've got some stories to tell us of insensitivity to people's differences and it just perpetuates, and that's why we've got to have these conversations. I said to Mayor Hosmer as I came in, I'm really envious that Laconia leaped to the front of the line with the Human Relations Commission. And so, David, thank you for the work that you do with your predecessors who might have formed this group. But we hope to catch up with you. Anyway, I've told the story. You hear it, you got the background. But there, you know, this is a country that provides opportunities for people from other countries to find the freedoms on which this country was founded. And when that identity of this country starts to get eroded or barriers go up, it really raises question marks for me. Maybe I'm too close to, you know, a generation that immigrated to this country, but it is disturbing to see where we're at, and and it's how insensitive we are to the voices of people who come from various experiences, not just European, but other parts of the world, and need that opportunity to find their identities in this country. Thank you for offering me.
Of course, thank you, Senator Khan. So what I do is to have you ask us questions. It can be to the whole panel, or it could be directly to any person on the panel. So Tom, Jay, Kathy, Ashley, or Evan. And I anticipate myself being, for those of us who are a little bit older, sort of the Phil Donahue of the audience here, running around with a microphone so that folks can hear what the question may be. So I open the floor.
I can do that.
Oh, we have a second mic. Wow, look at this. He's like the helper in the Phil Donahue show. I have no idea what to read.
I want to deviate a little from the Holocaust, broadly speak to teaching social issues in schools. And it seems like
Hold it on. Just hold it close.
okay, better? I didn't want to be too loud.
Yeah.
Seems like the opponents of everything that you're advocating for, and who are opponents of any sort of social issues on schools or in general, aren't even arguing about the same thing. They're arguing about some perverted idea that they've heard about somewhere else or around Facebook or whatever. So how do you, for those people, you have to first educate and then begin arguing. They're not even willing to be educated. So where do you begin when there's such a strong divide and the two sides don't even have the same information? How do you begin these discussions that we're having here?
It's a wonderful and important question, and I'll just start and then pass the microphone around. For me, it's all about non-identifying differences, right? All of us can say that I differ my opinion from you. And so I think it's starting a conversation by finding what is our common space. And so every conversation I begin with, I want to find out what we have in common. And on the surface, as Americans, we have one thing in common to begin with, which is our love of this country, this opportunity our country gives. There is so much common ground we can find first before we talk about any of these divisive issues, which of course is where people don't want to go, right? When divisive issues are labeled as things that are problematic that we can talk about, it's because they don't want to take that first step of saying hello to a neighbor, right? To find out, yes, we're all different. We're all going to have different points of view. My response to that is, let's start first by finding out what we have in common and develop that respect first.
So as an educator, thinking about my wonderful humans that I teach, there's even a lot of that just within the classroom, right? Especially in the last several years, our town is pretty divided where I teach, as far as what people believe and the misinformation that people have. And I agree, like social media, if anyone hasn't watched The Social Network on Netflix, wonderful documentary, and I told all my kids to watch it. But there's a lot of misinformation. So for me as an educator, there's kind of like a couple different pieces. The first is kind of what Tom was saying, right? You have to build a relationship. You can't go into it just arguing your point. That's not, no one's gonna listen to you if you're just shouting back, right? So being able to calmly, which is the hardest part sometimes, but like calmly listen to what other people have to say is such an important skill. And actually listen, right? Don't listen with the intent of rebuttal. Listen with the intent to hear them. So even if you don't agree, even if it's something that is very like against the core of everything that you believe, because I've had some of those conversations, even with family members, right? It's really important to show up and so they know that you hear them. So that's the first part, is like building that relationship. Another thing is that evidence is your friend, and knowing how to identify like what is great evidence is something that we try to teach to our students all the time. I work with my librarian all the time. We're always asking kids to go through and to evaluate their sources, whether it's they're just finding like an article that they have to read. We look at kind of like the matrix of different news sources, and we talk about like bias a lot and how to identify bias. What is the purpose of that? So I think teaching students those skills. Does that address the issue that we have right now? No, but it is a skill that hopefully in the future will open conversations. And then I can ask the students, you know, when they bring something up that I'm just like, that is misinformation, I can't just say that to them. I always go with, well, where did you find that? Can you show me the source that says that? And then we can go through the process of looking through it together. Obviously, this is with students, so it's a little bit different than like your neighbor who's shouting things at you, or you know, the family member at Thanksgiving, but still kind of the same rules apply, right? Like have valuable resources up your arsenal ready to go. Ask them where they're getting their information from. Are they getting it just from their Facebook feed, from Auntie so-and-so who posted it, who like doesn't even know what share means on Facebook, or are they getting it from like a reliable source? Is it something that they just heard in passing? And like, it's kind of like that game of telephone where something gets so skewed, right? That's kind of how I feel about a lot of things happening in our world today. Is like someone reads a source and then it's like 30 times down the road, the game of telephone, and it's so skewed at that point that it's not even real. Like, where are they getting that information from, and question it, right? Ask them, show them that you are willing to hear them. And I think that's a really good starting point, at least for me in my conversations I've had with people with differing views of things. Is the nice way to put it. Yes, Matt?
This mythical, what is it called, our critical race theory? What is it? I mean, you know, when people talk to me about it, I say, can you define it? It doesn't exist. It doesn't exist. It's a myth. It's something that I think people needed to throw at the base so they could be excited about something, you know, red meat. Let's talk about, yes, they're going to teach your children to hate themselves because they're white. What? Nobody teaches that. Somebody called me up because I was on the school board for 15 years. They said to me, are they teaching this hate your color in Barnstead? I said, what? Are you crazy? We're all white in Barnstead. There's two blacks in Barnstead. So really, when people tell you about this so-called critical race theory, ask them, A, what the definition is, and to show you the curriculum. That will shut them up. Also, the other way to deal with your enemies is to love them, because that really annoys people. That's love them.
It's true. That was an excellent question. I just want to say, as a teacher, like that's the kind of questions that I hope are being asked after our lessons.
We have another question over here. So I guess this goes mostly to the educators, but if you could just speak to the efforts and the training it takes with students as well as for yourselves in order to create a safe space where students feel safe with sharing their viewpoints and challenging each other's viewpoints without devolving into screaming matches. So sort of a follow-up to the last.
And I love that I sometimes put up the microphone, so thank you for that. Two quick anecdotal stories. I was doing a lower level class in high via Zoom meeting that I've been right, less opportunity. And as I was talking about the QAnon conspiracy theory, which is the resurrection of the protocols of the elders of Zion, for those who know what that is, in the background, a kid yelled out, "Proud Boys rule." And I had this existential crisis for about 3 seconds. But going back to what Ashley just said, here's how this unfolded. These kids come from a place of hurt, right? And there's some pain in that background. And my first thought was, oh my God, what has this kid suffered to believe this? So I just said, listen, I'm really interested in what you just said, what you talked about. And I said, and to make it really short, after quitting this Zoom relationship, I said, tell me, you're a kind of guy who seems to be outraged at injustice. You know, you're really, he says, I am. I said, can you give me one of those injustices? And he says, yeah, how President Biden is a pedophile. And my next response was, that is an incredibly important moral position to have. You clearly are against pedophilia, and that is to me an important moral statement. And I said, can you tell me any images you've seen? And he said one. Well, I just happen to have about 10 of them ready to go. And so I put one up. And he said, that's the one. That's the one. I said, that's fantastic. That's the one you saw. I said, do you know what the origin of that is? So what do you mean? You know, where it comes from? I said, you're not that kind of guy who just looks at one source. I know you. You're a moral, upstanding kind of guy. He says, what's the source? I said, well, and this is Joe. He's got his hands on a little blonde girl, and it's always on the internet. And I said, this was his son's funeral. That's his granddaughter. And every grandfather has the right to comfort his granddaughter at his son's funeral. That kid then changed on a dime. And he said, I didn't know that. I said, well, that's really good, but what are you moral person, you are going to do about that? And he said, I'm going to take that down right now. I said, is that enough? He said, no, it isn't enough. I'm going to take, and he went on and on. So this does work, respecting where these people are coming from. And the quick second anecdote I'll tell is, in a classroom, you have competing narratives and identities. One of the exercises we use is something called silent reading. So we'll take an anti-Semitic text or a passage from Nike and put it in 4 pieces of paper around the room, enlarged. And the rules are, no one can say a word in the classroom. What you must do is interact with the text by writing. And you rotate it. So what happens is they'll look at something, they'll circle it. I don't like this. Wow, what is this? You can write to the text, you can write to each other, you rotate the different stations. And this goes on for 5, 10, 15 minutes. And the class remains absolutely silent. In the follow-up, what happens always, the kids say, the silence was so important to us because we've never had that. The classroom became a sacred space. And the kid who never spoke through writing all the time. So everybody was equal. So those are the kind of techniques that are used. I'm hand over now to the realist.
You have to spend time in any class on respect. And if you don't help your students with a respectful classroom environment at the beginning of the year, then what are we doing in the classroom? They should have the ability to express themselves, but then look at evidence. And they're willing to look at evidence if they know that everyone around them is respectful. So I have to reiterate what Ashley said earlier with evidence and evaluating sources. The problem that I had when I went to school in the 90s, by the way, was there was a lack of resources that I could find, like the internet. That wasn't around like it is today. But now students are inundated with so much information. They don't know what to do. They don't know how to sort it or sift it or find what's relevant. But if we can have respectful conversations, what I found is sometimes the conversations that we're having in the classroom are much better than the adult conversations happening out on the street or in the communities. So that's how I organize my classroom. That's how I set up my expectations with students, and that's how I work with them.
And I'll just add on to that, so relationships obviously are so important, and it's just important in a classroom in general, right? That you're building these relationships, that they feel safe to be their true selves in your room. And even if they do have kind of this divisive idea, like that they feel safe to speak it, because I want to hear it. This is the place where I can help you sort through that, right? Like it should be a safe space for them to be able to say that to me. One thing with our freshmen that we do, because I don't know them when they come in, right? I've never taught them before. My Holocaust studies class are junior and seniors, and most of them I know. So it's a little bit different to build those relationships. we start the year with like really silly arguments. Like, is a hot dog a sandwich? Is cereal a soup? And like every day we spend like 5 minutes learning how to talk to each other because we don't know how. And I have found that like starting with something like so lighthearted, right? Marvel versus DC, like literally the silliest things that we can think of. And we start there and we like build these norms. And so we actually like come up with norms of like, this is what listening will look like for us in this classroom. This is what, you know, when I'm speaking, like, I'm gonna have evidence, right? They have to find evidence about cereal being a soup. Kids will look up the definition of soup. They will like look at gazpacho and like they go down the rabbit hole and it's wonderful to watch, but they have to learn how to do that in a respectful environment, right? So do it with something silly first, create that safe space. With Holocaust studies, we start right away with, because I know all of the kids and most of them know each other at that point, but we do create classroom norms within the first like 3 weeks. We watched, there's this amazing TED Talk by Clint Smith, who is one of my favorite poets, called The Danger of Silence. It's wonderful, I highly suggest watching it. It's really powerful. We start with that and we talk about like, why is it important for us to use our voices? And then in that Holocaust studies class, we create, and I literally like print and laminate and everyone signs like a classroom contract for the Holocaust studies because it's gonna be so heavy. And like, sometimes I throw in a silly one. Like one time it was like, stay hydrated. Because they were like, well, we can't have good conversations if we're not hydrated. And I was like, yeah, like you gotta give it to them. But like creating those safe spaces is so important to any sort of conversation, whether you're talking about something really deep or even just like something silly, because you would be surprised at how many almost fights there have been about cereal being a soup, including me. I feel very strongly about it.
And that's when you get the parent emails. So what did you talk about in class today? But establishing a respectful classroom culture is such an important, how to have dialogue, that's so important, so important. Even though from an outside perspective, it might seem silly and like, you wasted a day in school. No, 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 no. We actually really did something valuable that's gonna help us through the rest of the year. So.
Oh, do you want to answer? No, you're good.
Hello.
Hello.
So do you all agree that critical race theory doesn't exist?
A difficult question in that, right, the origin of critical race theory was, right, it was an academic exercise, but how it's been defined, limited, reduced to a political talking point. So clearly you have an origin story, you've got a now political story. And by the way, I think Senator Khan has been talking about which one is more, is hot dog a sandwich in the legislature, I think. And so that would be an answer, yes, that it does in fact exist because people believe it to be so.
But that implies that ideas exist apart from the human mind, or if they don't exist apart from the human mind. I guess that's where we disagree.
So tell me, what are you thinking? What was like?
Just because you don't think about something doesn't mean that it's not real. Clearly, the Holocaust is a good example of that. I think that, like, even if it exists and you think it's being misused by your political opponents, it doesn't mean that it's not something that we should be worried about, because it seems like the Germans didn't foresee what happened in Germany, just as the proletariat in Russia didn't foresee what would happen to them. And we don't, which we never talk about in school. I agree that we should be discussing the Holocaust in schools. I just don't trust your methods, because it seems to me like you're going in with a political mission to convert people that are descendants of clingers to conspiracy theories. And I don't, like, yeah, sure, they're conspiracy theories, but just like the attitude is going to change your pedagogy.
I just want to know, how will you describe a political identity? Because what we're talking about is history, truth, remembering stories, right? So how would that be a political identity?
It seems to me like the discussion of what the threats are in America that we're not actually getting down to, half the country disagrees with you, and they think that it's you. So like we should actually get into that. And I don't want to do that right now unless you do, but it seems to me.
No, I think it's a very valid point. And I think it's one where discussion begins, your question begins our discussion, so
Okay,
we'll have contact information afterward.
yeah, that sounds
And
great.
restart that conversation.
Thank you. I
Thank you.
learned about critical race theory in high school. I graduated in 2017 from high school.
Where did you go?
North Andover in Massachusetts. And it was like part of this critical media literacy class. And then I went to UMass Amherst, and every class that I took, I was an architecture major, they kind of wove it in as well. And like there was a class on Shakespeare, and my teacher said on the first day, I'm a critical race theorist, I'm interested in critical race theory. And it framed how we talked about Othello, it framed how we talked about all history of the modern era. I also took a class on pedagogy in UMass Amherst. It was called, it was a film class, and we watched films, and they were suggesting that the students that grew up to be teachers would show those films as well. We watched movies and talked about them and interpreted them with the critical race theorist lens. So I understand that it's real, and I understand that it affect, like all important movements begin as intellectual movements. I don't see how we don't understand that. Otherwise, what you do wouldn't be important. It wouldn't have an impact. I trust that you want to be good. I just think that like we should understand that the left can go too far as well.
How do you define critical race theory? How do you define it for me? Tell me what it is.
Okay, I'll read you a definition from a critical race theorist named Richard Delgado. What is critical race theory? The critical race theory movement is a collection of activists and scholars interested in studying and transforming the relationship among race, racism, and power. The movement considers many of the same issues that conventional civil rights and ethnic studies discourses take up, but places them in a broader perspective that includes economics, history, context, group and self-interest, and even feelings at the unconscious. Unlike traditional civil rights, which embraces incrementalism and step-by-step progress, critical race theory questions the very foundations of the liberal order, so it's further left than liberal, including equality theory, legal reasoning, Enlightenment rationalism, and neutral principles of constitutional law. Although CRT began as a movement in the law, it has rapidly spread beyond that discipline. Today, many in the field of education consider themselves critical race theorists who use CRT's ideas to understand issues of school discipline and hierarchy, tracking controversies over curriculum and history, and IQ and achievement testing. Political scientists ponder voting strategies coined by critical race theorists. Ethnic studies courses often include a unit on critical race theory, and American studies departments teach material on critical white studies developed by CRT writers. Unlike some academic disciplines, critical race theory contains an activist dimension. It not only tries to understand our social situation, but to change it. It sets out not only to ascertain how society organizes itself along racial lines and hierarchies, but to transform it for the better.
Well, that's a tall order. Can I just tell you, my husband, who's now deceased, he was a selectman, and he was talking to the ladies in the town, and he was saying to them, my wife and I are going to have a proper New Hampshire, proper American Thanksgiving this year. They said, oh really, what's that? He says, well, invite all our neighbors, give them a wonderful meal and kill them. Basically, it depends how you interpret it, because if we interpret our American past as all sunshine and kumbaya, we never killed any of the Indians. All these people, they just left, you know, all these people lived here before. No, they just left. Everything, and we never had slavery. Come on, I mean, we have to shine a light on what was wrong in the past so that we don't do it again.
Yeah, I don't have the racism is universal.
Do you still have the mic?
No,
Oh, okay.
it's okay. Yeah, racism is a human universal, and it existed, it exists. Tribalism is a human universal until America. And I think that we don't, like, we were talking about that just before, that, you know, although we were hypocritical, or not we, but the people that were part of America were hypocritical, that doesn't destroy the value of the standard, that racism is aberration.
And this is, I cannot wait. We're gonna have a great conversation.
You
So,
guys are gonna talk for hours.
We're gonna talk for
I'm not gonna
hours,
lie.
and I look forward to it. So thank you so much. And before you leave, make sure you and I have that contact information.
Yeah, sure.
Terrific. Other questions around there? That we have?
I would just like to.
Going over here to.
I don't give him any space.
Thank you, David. How are we to understand those that deny history, whether we're talking about the Holocaust or the Armenian genocide? What's the rationale behind their denial? And how should we confront it?
So I'm sorry, was the rationale behind Holocaust or genocide denial?
Exactly.
There is so multi-layered into your right. So one, it could be a defense mechanism. Can't believe this really happened or that we did it. When you talk to perpetrators, they often embrace what they did because one of the biggest things you have to wrestle with, and I try to touch on with perpetrators. At Auschwitz, it was a posting. You would go with your family. When I showed you crematory 1 or gas chamber 1, it's about 40 yards from the back door of the commandant's house, his villa, that his whole family lived in. And in the morning, the wife would tell the kids, wash the ashes off so the gas chamber was above ground. It was very loud. And it was 40 yards from the back door of their house. They heard it every day. How do you explain that behavior? Because perpetrators live in a moral universe of their own creating. It's not that they're amoral. They're incredibly moral. And what they do is they reorient the morality to the group they belong to. So you have these guards going at night, they're tucking their own children in, they're reading the bedtime stories, they're telling funny stories, they maybe even have sex with their wife. The next morning they walk in and they murder other people's families, right? How do you do that? So you've got to psychologically deny that's what's going on, you make yourself a victim. So there are layers and layers and layers. Some are anti-Semitic, some are afraid of race and all this, all these social constructs. So you have people who actually buy into this. So there's no easy answer to any question actually in this field. There is no easy or simple answer. It's multi-layered and multi-informed.
I have a question.
Yes, sir.
Both of my parents were in Europe in the Army. My father was a captain, Battle of Bulge. And later on, I was going to get drafted in Vietnam, but I signed up and flew helicopters in Vietnam and stayed through Desert Storm. But I wrestled with this question my whole life, you know, and I look at it as it's got to be more than just education, knowledge. Knowledge it doesn't seem to change anything, you know. So for years, I did research in the Bible, all the way back. You know, when we were kicked out of the Garden of Eden, you know, there was a curse put on the land. In order for the land to work properly, you had to have decaying proteins that provided nitrogen for things to grow. And then you look at Leviticus chapter 25 and 6, and it talks about remember, talks about the 10 commandments. And none of us remember the fourth commandment, which is to honor the Sabbath, which has stewardship of the land. It also has stewardship of how we treat each other, debt, forgiveness of debt, not making people slaves, not having people that have nice fancy houses, and so many unemployed, like we're in Germany. But this sickness, I believe, can affect all of us, just like you were just saying. It doesn't seem to make sense. But unless we steward the land properly, and I've had a lot to do with soil farming and how to create good organically rich soils and how that applies to all of this. And I think it applies to global warming and a whole bunch of other stuff. But when you look at Leviticus 25 and 6, there's a short chapter that says, if we comply with these rules, we're gonna live in peace and prosper, and a lot of blessings. But then there's a page and a half that tells you what's gonna happen if we don't. Because God knew that we wouldn't, we don't remember. So instead of just looking at the history of the problem, let's go back to some of the basics and know that we're all in this boat together like the Titanic. And unless we find better ways, we're all gonna be in trouble. Thank you.
First of all, thank you for your service. And second of all, I think what he's talking to, get the link to Kathy, so the last word, is you brought up what we've been talking about, which is the land is a common space, right, that we can all prosper from. And the idea is to build public spaces in which we can all generate each other's happiness, right? This is what it is. And so we have spaces like this, we're all welcome. We need to build out on that and make those spaces larger and larger. So thank you, sir, for that. Yeah.
I don't want to leave today feeling guilty about failing to say something and make another link. And I wasn't expecting the handoff from Tom. The things that my parents experienced in the 1930s that led to their emigration from Germany. One, they were fortunate they weren't interned early, but it was the dehumanization that took place along the way. It was the, you can't own a property, or you can't operate a store, you can't buy from a Jewish merchant, you can't attend the school that you did with your friends. You can't go to movie theaters, or you can't, you have to have a passport and wear a star and do all of it, and then it just escalated to, oh, well, we can get away with this, and so now we can get away with other things. And I guess the point is that I said to my mom at one point, oh, this could never happen here. I was a naive kid growing up in the United States and thinking, these things would never happen here. We're a democracy. We would never disenfranchise people. And, I did over the last few years feel that we were slipping in a manner that was beginning to disenfranchise people. We weren't responding in ways that democracies self-regulate themselves. And that was fearful for me. And I just wanted to be able to lay that on the table. Thank you for allowing me to.
There's one difference between America and Europe. Europe was is and was very tribal. People were either Italians or Hungarians or Romanians. Americans actually don't really exist. It's really a thought, an idea. You're all from different places. I'm looking around, you're all different colors, different sizes. You all come from somewhere else, so we're not tribal. I think it's difficult to get all Americans to agree to hate one particular race or one particular thing, because I don't think that we are as united in our origins. I think that helps us a lot. And the only last thing that I want to talk about is, this wonderful man, Ben Ferencz, who was the prosecutor in Nuremberg. He's still alive, he's over 100 years old. And he was telling a story, which I always tell the children at the end of my speech. He was telling a story that his old father, who was an immigrant, would sit his children down, him and his sister, they were quite young, and say to them every night at dinner, what have you done for humanity today? And when kids ask me, what can I do? I just tell them this story, and I say, you can all do something. Pick up a piece of trash, help an old woman across the road, help somebody carry something. We can all do something every single day. And I think basically Americans are good people. And if we can just light this little spark, and the children get it. That's all. Thank you.
read Katie's book, and I would encourage you to all look it up. You can get it. I don't get a commission for that. Because I really resonated with that simple message. The message is really simple. You call it the golden rule. Just be kind to others. And that comes back to you 100-fold. When you're in the supermarket, you're feeling really, geez, all these people, push for, stop a second. Say something nice to somebody else. Improve their day, and your day begins to improve just at that second. So I'll just offer that to take away from you. This is the Laconia Human Relations Forum. We're going to keep doing them. We're going to do more of them because we really believe what their message is, that we want to improve our public spaces, our forums. We've got a beautiful city here, but we need to also be a spark of humanity and radiate from here. So thank you all for coming out. Just a tremendous night. If you've got something short, I know teachers aren't short, but okay.
I was just gonna say, keep asking questions, right? Like, I always tell my kids, question everything. Like, even if it's not a question I want to hear, question it anyways. Like, I'm happy to explain, or I'm happy to show you sources, or, happy to have those conversations. But I think questioning everything is like the best advice I give to people. Questions. And please know that we're open to, at least I am, open to contact and other questions as well.
Sure.
Feel free. Yeah.
So thank you very much, and we'll just remain here.